Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed for a December Q&A session. When I started this channel, I was really hoping to get out Q&A sessions more frequently than I have, but been a bit busy lately doing things like building this set. We've also, of course, tested a lot of monitors lately on this very channel, which hopefully you've all seen and watched those reviews. Also, you guys asked over 200 questions on the YouTube community tab, so thanks very much to all of you who did submit a question for this video. Plus, we got a heap more from our Discord supporters, those who support us on Patreon and Floatplane. So heaps of questions, unfortunately not going to be able to get to all of them, but like I said, there will be many more Q&A sessions coming up next year where we'll get to answering plenty of your questions. So yeah, if your question wasn't answered in this video, don't worry, there'll be plenty more opportunities for that later. Anyway, let's get into the questions. All right, first question is from UB Hunter. Thanks for asking this one. How much improvement does a higher refresh rate monitor make if the refresh compliance is low? For example, the MSI MAG274QRX is a 240Hz monitor, but only has a 20% refresh compliance using the best overdrive mode at max refresh. Does using something like that still feel smoother and more responsive than a 165Hz monitor with 90% plus refresh compliance, or does the ghosting and blur mitigate the benefits of the extra hertz? So yeah, refresh compliance, there's a lot of interesting things to talk about here, I think. Refresh compliance is kind of one component that you get from testing sort of these high refresh rate monitors, and it only refers to one area of performance that extra hertz tends to bring. When you get a high refresh rate, you tend to get improvements in smoothness, and that's because more frames are being delivered. And refresh compliance doesn't really impact that. So if you're playing at 165 Hz, you're obviously going to be getting 165 frames per second. 240 Hz, you get 240 frames per second. More frames, it's going to feel smoother even with low refresh compliance because there's simply more frames being displayed. Similarly with latency, generally high refresh rate monitors are going to provide lower latency because they're refreshing more often, and that typically won't be impacted by refresh compliance either. So when you're comparing 240 Hz low refresh compliance to 165 Hz high refresh compliance, the 240 Hz monitor is still going to be better for smoothness, still going to be better for latency. So those two things are kind of separate. With refresh compliance, what we're really testing for is what's the limit of the motion clarity that that monitor is going to provide. When we get higher refresh rates, monitors do provide better motion clarity because you're getting more frames, which means as you're tracking things moving across the screen on a sample and hold monitor, more samples are being shown, the difference between each frame's lower, so you're going to get less blur attributable to the refresh rate. But then on top of that, you're also going to see some blur relating to the response times. So when you see those UFO test results, the blur that you're seeing is a combination of both the response times and also the refresh rate. And that's why even when we're testing like a 120 Hz OLED, which might have, sub 1 millisecond response times, it still looks a bit blurry. So what we're really looking for with refresh compliance is is there any difference between, say, running at 200 Hz versus 240 Hz? We're still going to be getting some blur at 200 Hz and at 240 Hz because of the refresh rate, but is that limited by the response times? Is the monitor too slow so it's kind of going backwards, effectively going backwards in terms of the motion clarity side of things? And that's where things like 20% refresh compliance come into play. We're looking at, okay, maybe this monitor, it only really has the performance to show 200 Hz or maybe 180 Hz or whatever it is. Then the motion clarity benefits as you, on that same monitor, go from 180 to 200 to 240, it may not appear visually very different. And we sort of saw some of this when we were testing the very early 1080p 360 Hz displays. We got 360 Hz in, and it provided a small motion clarity benefit compared to some of the 240 Hz monitors, but the response times weren't up to the standard of something like today's PG27AQN, where the response times really are giving you the full benefit of that refresh rate. So potentially if I can't quite remember the results from that MSI monitor, but potentially if the refresh compliance is low enough, then the motion clarity that you're getting isn't going to be that much different to running at 165 Hz, but you still would be getting the smoothness and latency benefits. So that's just something that you have to weigh up when buying those monitors. I tend to think 240 Hz over 165 Usually those monitors are at least going to be good around 200 Hertz in terms of refresh compliance, possibly a little higher than that as well. And certainly there are lots of products that do really good refresh compliance at that refresh rate. So for me, I would still tend to think that buying 240 Hertz is worth it. Whereas if this was like a 360 versus 240 Hertz example where you're really significantly relying on the motion clarity benefits, then maybe it's not as much of, doesn't make it as worth it to buy the higher refresh rate monitor. But yeah, like I said, it's just one component that we look at in terms of performance, and it's just one part of the story for the motion side of things when it comes to monitors. If you play on a fixed refresh rate, does your overdrive setting matter even if you aren't getting enough FPS to match Hertz? So I guess there's a couple of ways of looking at this question. Overdrive settings always matter from one perspective or another. If you're looking at this sort of question and you're thinking, okay, I've got a monitor which doesn't have a single overdrive mode experience, then if you're playing on a fixed refresh rate, it doesn't really matter too much whether it does or doesn't have a single overdrive mode experience, because you would just choose the best overdrive setting for that refresh rate. It wouldn't really matter whether it can or can't really handle variable refresh rate gaming, even if you aren't, running at the same FPS as your Hertz on the monitor. So from that side of things, yeah, fixed refresh rate gaming, overdrive settings don't matter as much because you're not having to consider the variable refresh rate aspect of things, which is pretty typical if you're playing competitive games. If you've got a 165 Hertz monitor, you're playing Fortnite, Overwatch, those sort of games where you can run at 165 Hertz, then yeah, the overdrive settings for variable refresh rate gaming or low refresh rates don't matter. But overdrive settings do still matter even when you're running at fixed Hertz, because you're going to get better performance at certain overdrive settings, even at that singular refresh rate. So it is still important to look at best overdrive settings for that refresh rate and optimizing it based around that. Even if you aren't, and that is also true even if you aren't getting enough FPS, because the monitor is still refreshing at that same refresh rate. It's just going to be duplicating frames or tearing frames depending on whether you're running VSync on or off. But you still are going to want to get the clarity benefits of when the monitor is able to show a frame, which let's say you're playing at 60 FPS on a 120 Hertz monitor, every second frame is going to be duplicated. But when that first frame is shown, if you've got your overdrive settings tuned, you're still going to get the best experience when that frame is displayed. So it definitely still matters, overdrive settings, when running at fixed refresh rates. But yeah, it doesn't matter as significantly as if you were using, say, adaptive sync or variable refresh rates. Should all future monitors support at least one USB-C input that has DisplayPort capabilities? Also, do you think that USB-C connectors will eventually phase out HDMI and DisplayPort connectors for display in and out? It's a good question from a number of perspectives. I think we don't see USB-C in a lot of monitors right now because most monitors are designed for desktop gaming and not a lot of graphics cards use USB-C outputs. I think even the RTX 40 series removed USB-C. Maybe that was done on the RTX 30 series, but certainly the latest NVIDIA GPUs removed USB-C as one of the standard display outputs that you get, preferring the standard HDMI and DisplayPort connectors. So monitors are still going to generally prefer the connectors that you would see on graphics cards and most desktop PCs because that's what they're designed for. I still do think though that USB-C is a good input to include because it does support a lot of people using laptops. USB-C is very common with DP alt mode for laptops, and if you're buying a desktop monitor, potentially you're using it for a laptop, potentially you're using it for a desktop and a laptop, in which case USB-C becomes really important. So I'm not sure whether they should all include it. It's kind of is that going to be a deciding factor in a review for me? Probably not. I'm probably going to stick to more the panel performance side of things as opposed to whether it does or doesn't have USB-C. I don't think it's a deal breaker, but I think it would be nice. As for, do you think the USB-C connectors will eventually phase out HDMI and DisplayPort? That is a trickier one. I think the issue with USB-C is you can do so many things with USB-C that it's hard to tell what each port and what each cable and what each connector can actually do. Like, is that USB-C port on your display, does it do the right power delivery specs? Does it do DisplayPort alt mode, or is it just It could be a USB-C input that only links it for the OSD settings or for the the software utilities that a lot of monitor manufacturers provide. It might not be an actual display connector. Now, I hope monitor manufacturers don't do that, but USB-C does provide the capabilities to have one monitor which allows you to use USB-C for the display connection, another monitor where it's only used for OSD control and software side of things. So from that perspective, HDMI and DisplayPort are more, I guess, easier to understand from a consumer perspective. DisplayPort and HDMI only do display connections. So if you've got them, it's really clear what you can and can't plug into the monitor. If it's got DisplayPort, you can only plug in DisplayPort devices. If it's got USB-C, there's potentially some confusion around that. So I don't think we'll see HDMI and DisplayPort phased out. Also, the cable quality comes into play here. Maybe DisplayPort cables, especially for like low refresh rate monitors, might be more reliable than you would see from a USB-C cable. You need to make sure you've got a really high quality USB-C cable to run high refresh rate, high resolution monitors. There might be more availability of those cables for DisplayPort, or certainly it would be easier to tell that you've got a good quality cable when you've got a DisplayPort cable versus USB-C, when some USB-C cables, they're only designed for charging phones and that sort of thing. So yeah, there's sort of lots of things to consider here. I think it should be included as an input on monitors. I think it's a good inclusion, but yeah, I don't think it's going to be replacing the standard connectors that we've got anytime soon. Next question, do you expect IPS/VA panels to remain relevant long term, or will OLED take over in coming years? Yeah, not sure about this one. It's always one of these predicting the future questions, so who knows, maybe you'll look back at this in a few years and I will have been horribly wrong. I think IPS and VA will still remain relevant for the time being, especially because OLED has existed for a little while now, especially on the TV side of things. So they're just sort of becoming new on the monitor side. It's very exciting that we're getting OLED monitors for the first time. But TVs, OLEDs have been around for, we're probably approaching a decade now. Don't quote me on that one. But we are certainly approaching many years of OLEDs and LCDs being viable. And even throughout all that time, there is still reason to buy LCD panels. You might not want to deal with the burn-in risk. So for example, if you have children that might maybe leaving static content on the screen for long periods of time, you just want the reliability to, and you want to know that that's not going to be an issue for you, then you'd buy an LCD. Or potentially you're running your display in a really bright environment. You might want to go LCD because they're brighter. And I think those benefits to IPS and VA panels will remain for the next couple of years when faced up against OLED. You're also going to get the benefit of cheaper panels. Like, is OLED going to be coming to the $200, $300 sort of price points that we see IPS and VA panels a lot, especially for monitors? I think that's pretty unlikely. So yeah, I would still expect IPS and VA to be the dominant tech for those sort of bang for buck budget monitors. If you're buying, say, 1440p 165Hz, it's pretty likely for the next few years that's still going to be an LCD based panel. As for like your high-end gaming, yeah, probably if you're spending $1,000 and you want HDR, then OLED is likely to become a very dominant player in that market. But as for taking over, I think until OLED can really solve those issues with burn-in, brightness considerations, pixel structure is another one. Is it suitable for desktop productivity use because of, maybe a weird subpixel layout and also the burn-in considerations? All those things are going to play out for OLED versus LCD. And I still think there are going to be people, even when they're buying high-end monitors, that may choose an LCD with mini LEDs as opposed to OLEDs because they might have a certain use case for them that makes the LCD option better. So yeah, OLED's going to be great, but I don't think it's taking over in the next couple of years. Do you believe QD-OLED monitors will come down significantly in price next year, with several new models being announced / coming out? I want an upgrade, but would love to see them break below the $1,000 mark first. Well, this is one of these questions where I could be burnt pretty hard on, because I was expecting the QD-OLED monitors that we've got to be more expensive than they are. I think the Alienware monitor coming out at $1,300, we've now got the DWF variant for $1,100. Before those displays were announced, if you said they were going to be below $1,500, I probably wouldn't have believed you. I was pretty convinced that they would be very expensive products, but they've turned out to be pretty reasonable. So I don't want to say for certain that they're not going to quickly drop in price below $1,000, but again, we're sort of talking about high-end monitor technologies, so will they come down in price significantly? I'm not sure. I think around $1,000, maybe $900 or even $800 is possible, especially because we've got, say, LG's 42-inch OLED TVs. They typically go on sale for like $900 US. We're starting to see some of the true HDR monitors, the Neo G7, for example, that dropped to $800 US during the latest sales. So I think that's sort of where we're seeing high-end monitor pricing at the moment. Possibly it could get down to around there. But if you're talking like $500, I think that's almost certainly not going to happen. But yeah, if I was sort of looking at an upgrade for QD-OLED and we're sort of seeing those new, say, the MSI variant, the Samsung variant of the QD-OLED ultra-wide, then yeah, if it gets to $1,000, I think that would be a really good price, but I would be more expecting those monitors to be similarly priced to what we've already got in the sort of $1,100 to $1,300 price range. So we'll see about that. There is obviously a lot of competition coming, so hopefully there'll be a bit of a price war on those technologies. But yeah, I'd sort of be looking at, if you can get something for $1,000, you've done really well, so that's sort of where I'd be looking at. Next question, do you personally prioritize a high refresh rate / good response panel or a better HDR performing panel / more color accurate display for your general use, such as your own personal monitor? It's a really tricky question to answer because I kind of like having the best of everything if possible. So for my personal use, I tend to, I guess, not always use high-end displays, but typically, you know, I've got access to quite a few displays, so I tend to use one of the best displays I currently have access to. So if we're talking purely about gaming, then for me, being more of a single-player gamer, not someone that's super interested in competitive games, I personally would prefer to use an HDR-capable monitor than, let's say, the PG27AQN that does 360 Hz. If I was mostly playing like maybe competitive games like Fortnite, then yeah, maybe I'd be choosing the Asus monitor. Whereas for me, I do use the Alienware AW3423DW because it delivers really good HDR performance. It's got reasonable color accuracy and also does have really good response time. So when I'm playing at 175 Hz, it feels really fast and clear in motion, which is something that I do like, even playing single player games. I think that does have benefits. So for me, buying monitors, I would tend to swing for gaming more towards the HDR route, and I probably would go with an OLED. I did actually buy the Alienware monitor, so I guess I did buy the display I use for gaming, more of a work / testing related purchase. But yeah, that's how I would generally go with things. But then again, like, even if I was choosing an HDR monitor with good color accuracy, if that was the way I went, I still wouldn't tolerate really slow response times. So if you're kind of tossing up between a balanced product that did balanced HDR and balanced response times versus really good HDR with really bad response times, I would still choose, I think, the more balanced product, just because things like VA smearing is really horrible. Like, I think we've gone well past that in monitor tech in the last couple of years, where you don't really need to deal with that issue. So for me, yeah, I would still choose the more HDR focused thing, as long as it's balanced. However, if we're talking about like my productivity monitor that I would use with my workstation for editing videos, then there's a whole other sort of consideration for there. And I wouldn't really be choosing HDR for that, but then I wouldn't be choosing necessarily good response times either, because that's also not that important. I would definitely be prioritizing things like screen uniformity, color accuracy, especially like, does it have hardware SDR modes or hardware calibration? I still want high refresh rate when I'm doing my productivity work and editing. I still think 60 Hz is very slow these days. Don't really want to be using that. So I still do use, I guess you'd call them more gaming focused monitors for productivity work. But again, it would be things like, how good's the sRGB mode? How good's the calibration? How easy is it to calibrate? You know, what's the color performance like? Uniformity? Has it got good pixel structure? All those sorts of things would play into that decision. So yeah, with my new setup where I've got a workstation and gaming setup separately, I can sort of prioritize a bit better between the monitors I have available for me. But yeah, I'm rarely going to be choosing a 240 Hz display, especially with what we've got on the market today. Maybe those new OLEDs coming out will tempt me over, but yeah, for now, the Alienware's been really good. Some people have tried 8K gaming and noticed the differences are practically imperceptible from 4K, with resolution reaching a point of imperceptibility and frame rate increases with extremely minimal gameplay / enjoyment benefits, like going from 240 FPS to 360. What are some big changes you predict monitor developers will pursue in the future? Yeah, I think resolution is kind of one of the least important things to be upgrading in a monitor at the moment. We've got 4K, which has been, for most sizes that you would typically use on a desktop, like 27, 32 inch, 4K is pretty much fine. Like, you wouldn't really get much benefit going from 8K. 8K may be a benefit if you went for like a 42 inch monitor, maybe, depending on how sensitive you are to resolution. But certainly it's not an area that I would be prioritizing if I was designing monitors right now. I do think that there are many areas that developers will be pursuing in the future. The biggest one is sort of, how do we tackle all of the HDR capabilities that is designed into the standard, like the HDR10 standard, Dolby Vision standard, Rec 2020. How do we get monitors doing all of that stuff? Because right now we've got monitors that top out maybe at best at like 85% Rec 2020 coverage. So can we go the full Rec 2020 coverage? That says probably not a high priority, but it's certainly something to think about there. Also on top of that, how do we get all the range of HDR being possible in all conditions? Because right now, most HDR displays are sort of, they're thinking of compromises about how to do things. Do we need to do tone mapping because the brightness of the display doesn't get bright enough to display a lot of content? In that case, can we push brightness higher? Can we push brightness higher for full screen sizes so that we don't need to rely on brightness limiters and ABLs more often? Can we get all conditions that we want to display to do all the brightnesses? Like, let's say we've got a 2000 nit monitor. Can we do that from everything from full screen white all the way down to like 1% or less than that? Does the dimming abilities that we've got allow us to show bright and dark areas close together? And how tight can we get that dimming? Can we show things like star fields really bright but with really deep blacks at the same time? I think a lot of the focus that we'll see for improvements for monitors and display tech over the next couple of years, next maybe decade, is going to be solving a lot of those considerations. So obviously there's still going to be incremental improvements for things like response times, if we're talking the LCD side of things. In terms of refresh rate, can we get higher and higher and higher? But I think the biggest gains that we've seen from monitors in the last couple of years, and TVs and all those sorts of things, is answering those questions of, let's bring up brightness, let's increase the amount of dimming zones, let's get contrast better, let's target HDR, and make it so that when movie makers are mastering their stuff on $30,000 mastering displays, that a consumer who only has $1,000 to spend can still get a very similar experience. That said, I still think there are going to be benefits from increasing things like response times and refresh rates. Even going from 240 to 360 has benefits for smoothness and latency. It does feel better to use a monitor like that, especially if you then go backwards. It's always more noticeable when you upgrade to a higher refresh rate, you get used to it, then you go backwards to the low refresh rate. And obviously with all monitor technologies at the moment really harnessing sample and hold, the higher that we go in things like refresh rate, the better we're going to get in terms of motion clarity. We're not going to need to rely on backlight strobing as much, because the refresh rate is just going to be so high that the difference between each frame is going to be very low, and we're not going to get as much sample and hold motion blur. So yeah, I agree that resolution is one of those things that's really at sort of diminishing returns level at the moment. But I think in terms of response times, refresh rates, HDR capabilities, brightness, color gamut, there's still so many areas where displays can improve. I think what you'll see a decade from now is going to be significantly better than what we've got even today. Even as good as some of those OLEDs and those sorts of things look, I think there's still many areas to improve. If a monitor doesn't have a single overdrive experience, would you potentially recommend lowering the maximum refresh rate? For example, setting a maximum of 120Hz if a 165Hz monitor can't cover its entire refresh range at one setting. No, that's not really something I would consider doing. Maybe, can't really speak for everyone. There may be a use case where you find a benefit for that. Potentially, maybe the performance is really bad across the entire refresh range. But I think the easiest way to sort of deal with that scenario is just lowering the overdrive setting. If you're sort of concerned about, I've got a 165Hz monitor, I'm expecting to play 60 FPS all the way up to 165Hz, is there going to be a benefit there if I just cap it to 120, just let my games run only up to 120, but still, get the benefit of 60 FPS? I think doing that's not going to be as advantageous as just lowering the overdrive setting a little bit and optimizing more for low refresh rate gaming. So when it comes to these like single overdrive mode experience versus dual overdrive mode, you kind of typically are going to be tossing up between, do I preference gaming at a high refresh rate, in which case I'll use a slightly higher overdrive setting, or do I preference gaming at a slightly lower overdrive setting, in which case I'll preference a lower overdrive and refresh rate and all that. So typically, if you're playing at a higher refresh rate, the issue that you'll get dragged into with those non-single overdrive mode monitors is that you'll see a lot of overshoot when gaming at 60 FPS, which is, I guess, what this person is sort of thinking about with this question. Maybe if I instead optimize for lower refresh rates instead, and then I'm not going to get that overshoot. And then if I cap it at 120 Hertz, I'm not going to deal with the slower response times at higher refresh rates. But I think a lot of people will only see very minor impacts from lowering the overdrive setting and then still running at 165 Hertz. Yeah, you may not be getting the full motion clarity benefits of 165 Hertz. You may have low refresh compliance. It may still have a lot of blur and ghosting at those sorts of high refresh rates, but you're still going to be getting the smoothness benefits and the latency benefits from running at 165 Hertz. And I think those benefits offset the sort of, I guess, clarity differences from optimizing for the lower refresh rate configuration. So I wouldn't really recommend capping monitors in that sense. I think you would just, if you're worried about sort of not getting overshoot, you want to optimize for lower refresh rates, just set your overdrive setting for a lower refresh rate. And then, if you're pushing frame rates above 120, honestly, it's probably not going to be that bad. It isn't going to be as optimal as if you bought a single overdrive mode experience monitor, though they are typically more expensive. But yeah, I don't think refresh capping is really the solution to that sort of conundrum with your monitor. When I buy a new monitor, what steps do you recommend I take for calibration? I know that the out-of-box experience varies greatly from monitor to monitor, and all my knowledge on it is to change the ICC profile. Is there anything more past that? So yeah, this is one of those tricky questions, because to get the best calibration experience, you're going to need external hardware like a colorimeter, I1 display, SpiderX, something like that, because not only is that going to allow you to generate a specific ICC profile for your monitor, which is going to be the most accurate, but it's also going to allow you to profile different areas to performance. So for example, if you wanted to know what is the exact brightness setting that I need to run at 100 nits or 200 nits, you're not going to be able to judge that by eye. You're going to need a tool. What's the highest contrast ratio setting? Am I getting clipping or other issues from raising contrast too much? Again, a colorimeter is going to tell you that with the greatest level of accuracy. So when it comes like the out-of-box experience, it really depends on what other stuff have you got available to you. Can you compare it to a known accurate display? That's going to give you some indication of what settings you need to change. But generally speaking, you're going to need a reference. You're not going to be able to tell by eye. I've tested a lot of monitors at this point, and I'm getting a little better at telling when things are correct or not just from my eye. But even then, I'm not even close to the performance that I get from a tool, right? Like I can tell a few things, but I'm just not capable of doing what calibration tools can do. And that's with a fair bit of experience testing these things. So yeah, I think if you're just trying to eyeball it, look, out of the box, you're probably going to be able to tell if something is really off, like if the white balance is really tinted either too cool or too warm. You're probably going to be able to tell that, especially up against a standard reference monitor. But the things that I would do if I had a monitor and I just bought it and I want to consider the out-of-box experience, these days most monitors do come with pretty reasonable factory settings. Most of the monitors that I test may not be super accurate in terms of like delta E's below 2 or below 1 or whatever we're targeting, but they're still going to be pretty good. Like you're not going to have to make too many adjustments to contrast settings or gamma settings. Generally what they use out of the box is going to be close to the most accurate settings. Maybe 1 or 2 tweaks are all that's necessary. So from that perspective, I would just look at sort of a review and sort of see how accurate is that out-of-box experience. If it's wildly off, then I'd be messing around with the settings, trying to get that looking a bit better. There have been examples of monitors with wildly off white balance out of the box, but lots of them look pretty good. The only thing I would also consider is like, if I've bought a wide gamut monitor, do I want to run it in the sRGB mode? And is the sRGB mode any good? Hopefully, again, a review is sort of going to give you an indication of that. But that's sort of something I'd be considering. If I'm using it as an SDR monitor, I generally would recommend enabling the sRGB mode, or potentially using one of the software utilities that you've got on your computer. Again, there's like the no video sRGB utility if you've got an NVIDIA GPU, things like that to sort of reduce some of the saturation and oversaturation you might get with a wide gamut monitor. So yeah, I think that's sort of the main steps that I would take. But yeah, generally these days monitors have gotten to a point where you're not getting a terrible out-of-box experience. Some monitors are better than others in terms of how accurate and calibrated they are, but they're not going to give you wildly horrible things. Like especially with TVs, a lot of the time where you'd get a bad image quality straight out of the box is going to be because of processing features like noise reduction or motion smoothing, a big thing for TVs to turn off. And yeah, generally you'd want to turn all that stuff off. But on monitors, a lot of that stuff doesn't apply. They don't tend to apply noise reduction and those sorts of things out of the box. So yeah, not have to worry about it too much, I don't think. As someone interested in getting a 4K 32-inch monitor, is it worth it over a 1440p 32-inch? And since I am aiming to build a new system, what specs should I be aiming for if I want to play on high settings? So as far as like what system you should buy and what specs you should get, definitely recommend checking out our other channel, Hardware Unboxed, where you get all the recommendations on hardware for gaming at 4K or 1440p there. Generally these days with upscaling, things like DLSS, FSR, you may not necessarily need too much of a hardware upgrade. It depends what you're coming from, of course. If you're on a really old GPU, then it's probably worth looking at a more powerful product there. But yeah, upscaling and things are going to work pretty well for 4K these days. When it comes to the monitor side of things though, do you go 4K 32-inch or do you go 1440p at 32-inch? I think a lot of this is going to come down to the pricing of the displays. If we take a really good value product, like for example, Gigabyte's M32Q versus M32U, so they're both 32-inch size, both the same family of displays, I guess you'd say, and then the U model 4K, the Q model 1440p. To get the M32Q, you're looking at about $330 US these days. For the M32U, the 4K model, you're looking at about $600 US. So you're not quite having to double the price, but it's pretty close to needing to double the price. So that's going to play significantly on this discussion. I think for a lot of people who are just doing gaming first, like you're buying a monitor, it's primarily going to be for gaming. You're not doing a heap of web browsing or productivity work or writing documents. You've got your set up for gaming. Then I think you're going to get a better bang for buck, a better value getting the 1440p option. A lot of people complain about 32-inch 1440p pixel density not being as good as 4K. That's definitely true. You're going to get better image quality going 4K at 32 inches. You're going to get better resolution for things like editing documents, web browsing, anything text related is going to look a lot better on the 4K display. Games though, they are going to look better at 4K 32-inch, but 1440p 32-inch, in my opinion, it still looks pretty good. And when you're talking about $330 versus $600 for gaming only, with a lot of the specs otherwise pretty similar, I think the bang for buck factor is pretty clearly in the 1440p class there. But then again, if you have the money to spend, like you were budgeting to spend around $600 on a monitor or even higher than that, then there are benefits to getting 4K even for gaming. It is a better experience. You are going to not going to see as much aliasing. The pixels aren't going to be as obvious, and those things do play out for games. And again, a lot of the time these days, you can use technology like DLSS and FSR to limit the frame rate hit that you're going to get upgrading your resolution in that way. But for me, the reason why I would go 4K is if I was using the monitor for other things as well. If I was web browsing or editing even spreadsheets or editing videos or photo editing in Photoshop or any of those sorts of things, 4K is a significant upgrade. Not just for the resolution and clarity of the text, but you can, depending on how good your eyesight is and how close you want to use the monitor, you can also tend to mess around with the scaling settings so you can fit not physically, but you can fit more stuff on the screen at the same time, which may have a benefit for you depending on what sort of things you're doing and again, how good your eyesight is. So if I wanted a balanced experience for multiple use cases, 4K 32-inch, definitely the way to go. Plenty of benefits for spending nearly double the amount. But But if I was going gaming only, I think bang for buck factor is definitely with the 1440p option, just because that price difference is still quite significant. If the 4K option was down around $400, maybe $500, it would be a bit of a different discussion, but I think with pricing as it is today, that's the sort of thing I would go with. With good monitor deals coming this month, which upgrade do you see as having more value over 27-inch 2K 144Hz? So baseline, 1440p 144Hz, all right? And then, so the two options we've got, high refresh rate like 240Hz Gigabyte M27QX that you've recommended recently, or 4K like the Gigabyte M28U and others. So yeah, I imagine a fair few people are sort of going to be tossing this up because the 4K options typically is still slightly more expensive than the M27QX. The M27QX is about $400. The 4K options, I know the M28U has been as low as about $450, but typically you're looking at $500 to $550 US for the 4K option. And this is sort of a little bit different to the 32-inch discussion where we're sort of talking 4K versus 1440p. What are the sort of price differences? How much can you save? This is kind of like same budget. Do I go 1440p 240 or do I go 4K sort of 144 hertz? And I think this is it's a very similar sort of answer to what I gave previously. If you're looking for something that's balanced and versatile for multiple use cases, then you probably go the 4K option. So if you're gaming, you're browsing the web, productivity work, you have a home office or something that you also use for gaming, similar to me, for example, or you're doing Photoshop work, the 4K display is going to have many benefits for you. And depending on the games that you play, also the 4K monitor is going to be really well suited to that high refresh rate, high resolution. It's going to look great for your sort of single player titles and even some multiplayer gaming as well, if you're not super needing those sort of latency benefits and high refresh rate that those other products can bring. So yeah, if I'm a multi-use sort of monitor user, I had multiple use cases, gaming was part of that, then I think the 4K option is probably where I would go for most of those users. But then if I was gaming only, then potentially the 1440p 240Hz option is where I would go. Not only are they a little bit cheaper, the 240Hz option is obviously great for competitive gaming. So if I was playing heaps of multiplayer titles, things like, the new Call of Duty game, Overwatch, Fortnite, those sort of games, then 1440p 240Hz I think would clearly be in the lead there. If I was running on low settings and I was getting over 200 FPS, then the 240Hz monitor is going to give me benefits there, not just in terms of latency, which is obviously a big consideration, but also motion clarity. It's going to be easier to spot enemies. There's going to be less blur on a monitor like that, and you're going to get a lot of benefits. But also, even if you were only playing single player titles, I think the 1440p 240Hz option does give you a lot of room for future hardware upgrades. And yes, games are also going to get harder to run on newer hardware. But today, if you're buying an RTX 4080 or RTX 4090, which again is very high in hardware, so would you pair that with a $400 display? I'm not sure. But certainly as you're upgrading to hardware down the track, where a 4090 may be coming down in price with a future generation or something like that, then I think what we're going to be seeing is that monitor is going to give you more headroom for the future, and maybe you've got a favorite game that you love playing, maybe that's exceeding 144 hertz. Now you can run it at 200 FPS, 240 FPS, and yeah, it's maybe not necessary for single player gaming, but it will still give you a better experience. It's going to be clearer to see, all that sort of thing. So I think that's sort of where I'd go. Gaming only, want that future proofing and upgrading, doing competitive gaming, 1440p 240 hertz makes the most sense. If I was more inclined towards single player gaming, or if I needed a versatile bounce product for multiple use cases, then I'd go with the 4K monitor. Why don't most 1440p gaming monitors come with an sRGB mode enabled by default and focus on good factory calibration for that mode, since that's what matters in games and most applications, while wide gamut is mostly only for professional work? The Asus PG279QM does this, but it costs $750. It seems odd to me that there are a lot of mid-range options marketed for gaming, but not heavily focusing on sRGB factory performance. I think there's a few reasons for this. I think the main reason is that while accuracy may be important for people like us that watch enthusiast monitor channels, test monitors are really keyed into things like accuracy being important. I think when you're looking at casual buyers, your sort of typical buyer, having the wide gamut mode enabled by default is going to give you more wow factor. So it's not going to be accurate, but you're going to see increased saturation. People are going to get their monitor out of the box. They're going to use it. They're going to be like, wow, the colors on this, they look better than my previous non-wide gamut monitor. The better colors, that looks better to me. We've seen this with, say, processing photos on phones over time. They've gone for more saturation over the years as opposed to doing the more natural processing look. And I think we see similar with displays, especially if you're buying at a retail store where all the displays are sort of there and you're comparing them one versus the other. You're going to be drawn towards the monitor with the most vibrance, the most saturation, the widest color gamut out of the box. So I think that's the main reason why monitor manufacturers stick with wide gamut modes being enabled out of the box. They want people to be wowed straight away and to be very impressed with their purchase. The second reason I think is that a lot of monitors, the scaler isn't good enough to support an sRGB mode with other settings being unlocked. So on a lot of monitors, if they ship with the sRGB mode enabled by default, which I think is still the best way of doing things, then you're going to run into issues where people can't change the white balance. They can't change the gamma settings. These are settings that a lot of people do mess around with, which are enabled when the wide gamut mode is enabled. So when we see all of those factors, the vibrance out of the box wowing people, and also some of the scalar limitations, I think that's where most monitor manufacturers gravitate towards that one option. If scalers were better and were able to support things like sRGB modes plus a lot of the settings unlocked and giving you the full flexibility to just switch between sRGB and wide gamut with no restrictions, which would be the ideal way of doing things, and I wish every monitor would do that, then I think you'd see more monitors maybe going the accuracy route. And that's where monitors like the PG279QM come into play. That monitor has a G-Sync module. It's a more powerful scaler. It allows the OEM to set an sRGB mode without restricting any of those features. And that's why I think brands like ASUS are more comfortable doing that, because again, you're buying a high-end product. You're probably more of an enthusiast. You're going to be using those sorts of features. You want the best accuracy, and also the scaler can support all the different configurations that someone might want to run. So hopefully over time we will see, I think, more of a focus towards monitors that in the SDR mode run using Rec 709 colors / sRGB colors with good accuracy. They enable that mode by default, and then when the HDR mode is enabled, they switch over to the wide gamut mode. I think that's sort of where we're heading towards. It makes the most sense. But for now, a lot of hardware isn't quite good enough or powerful enough to do that just yet, unfortunately. But yeah, that's sort of where we're aiming for with these reviews and why we encourage sort of sRGB mode accuracy, those sorts of things, because I do think it's important. All right, and that does it for this month's Q&A session. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions, whether that was on the YouTube community tab or in our Discord community. I know we only answered about 12 out of well over 200 questions, but I still really appreciate everyone that does submit your questions. I enjoy reading them all and sort of seeing, what are the sort of talking points of today. I think it's good to know all that stuff for reviews and sort of the content that we want to make in the future. So really appreciate all of you guys. But also, if your question wasn't answered, then you will have an opportunity in a future Q&A to submit your questions, because I'm planning more regular Q&A sessions on this channel, especially with the volume of questions that we are getting. Also, if you do want to support Monitors Unboxed, Hardware Unboxed, the whole family that we've got here, please do consider supporting us on Patreon or Floatplane. Links to those in the description. You will get access to our Discord community where we have our own Q&A channel where you can answer questions, and I'm probably more likely to see a question in there. As well, you'll gain access to things like monthly live streams, BTS videos, ICC profiles, all that good stuff. So thanks for watching this one. It's probably been a long one. Not sure. I think I've been recording for like an hour now, so we'll see what it comes out to in the final video. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.